My friend Sarah died a few years ago. She died in circumstances many of us hope for. She died in hospice in an excellent and lovely nursing home. Her adult children were attentive. Her husband lived on site and was her dedicated and fierce advocate. While Sarah's circumstances were enviable in many ways, she also died in the way most of us fear, from a disease that lasted years and which made her more incapacitated and vulnerable by the day. Her husband couldn't be in her nursing home room 24 hours a day to ensure Sarah was being treated well all the time. And most of the nurses' aides were great. Some were new and learning, and some didn't have a lot of compassion. So Sarah was at the mercy of the integrity of each aide. Sarah could be described with some lyrics from the musical Chicago, because for some of the aides, Sarah might as well have been called Mr. Cellophane. The lyrics to this song go, "Everyone gets noticed now and then, unless that person should be invisible, inconsequential me. Mr. Cellophane should have been my name, 'cause you can look right through me, walk right past me, and never know I'm there." That's undoubtedly what the widow in Mark's gospel felt like, invisible and inconsequential. In Jesus' day, women only existed in relation to their husbands and married sons. A woman alone with money in her control, as this woman was, meant she was a widow with no family to take her in. Powerless and contributing nothing to society, she was invisible and prey to those who would take advantage of her. As Jesus sat opposite the treasury, he would have seen her as a woman who had been persuaded to give all she had. The widow would have believed that if she gave what she had, God would be faithful and provide back. The way God would provide was through the temple treasury system. The religious authorities at the treasury were supposed to collect the donations and distribute it. The money was supposed to be given to the widows, the orphans, the immigrants, and the ill. The money was supposed to care for those who were invisible and inconsequential. The authorities were supposed to distribute those funds because the Lord had commanded it. The Lord, who all the way back in the book of Deuteronomy had singled out feeding and clothing the widows, orphans, and the immigrants. The Lord had said that it was the soul of the covenant to feed and clothe those who were the most vulnerable. The Lord said this because his people had known what it was like to be poor and powerless as slaves in Egypt. The Lord said that to care for the vulnerable was the first and most basic response of gratitude for their freedom. As Jesus watched the widow, he knew all this. He also knew that the religious authorities knew it. In addition, what Jesus knew and the authorities knew, but the widow probably didn't know, was that the authorities embezzled those treasury funds to buy themselves beautiful robes. The authorities knew that they could get away with it, because even if the poor did come to find out, the poor, like this widow, were powerless and therefore of no consequence. They were poor, cellophane people. As much as the authorities' hypocrisy angered Jesus, on one count, though, he must have felt a twinge of understanding with them. Jesus, in both the Gospels of Matthew and John, said, "You will have the poor with you always." Jesus knew that even if every penny placed in the temple treasury were used for the poor, there were so many of them, only so much could be accomplished. The hopelessness of the masses of poor must have been horribly frustrating. Frustrating, too, because there was no help to be given for this particular widow. Because you'll notice in this story, there is no glorious Samaritan woman at the well moment. Jesus didn't talk with this woman or help her understand that he was the Messiah. He didn't give her hope that he was about to turn everything upside down and set all to rights. Although later, when Jesus hung on the cross, he would make sure his own widowed mother would have a home with his best friend, Jesus didn't even offer to this widow a loaf of bread, let alone 5 fish. It would seem that his hopelessness and frustration over the plight of the masses of poor got to Jesus because he just walked away from her. It's as if he shrugged his shoulders to say, thus it has ever been, and thus it will ever be so. The invisible, inconsequential poor and powerless will always be with you. Jesus' hopeless and frustrating prediction seems to have been proven right. The invisible, inconsequential poor and powerless are still with us. They are people we don't see at all, or don't see them as worthy of our notice. They are people like my friend Sarah, powerless in nursing homes. They are the people who have been living on our streets for so long, we look right through them. They are immigrants to our cities, some of whom are victims of human trafficking. Others are people who have been shunned by their families and have nowhere to go. Some are just the kids at school who are so quiet they blend in with the lockers. And some are illiterate 12-year-olds who likely face a life of poverty. Some are people who are vulnerable to those who will sell them a meal or a place to sleep for the right price. So how could Jesus just walk away? How could Jesus, who preached compassion for the poor and powerless over and over, just walk away from that widow? How did he walk away and move on to the next topic? Jesus did walk away from the widow all the way out of the temple. And he did move on to the next topic. But the next topic was reform. Spurred by his frustration for that widow and all the poor and powerless, Jesus' next topic was reforming the temple. That is, reforming the temple with its original building blocks of compassion, gratitude, and covenant. Reforming the temple with priority seating for the poor and powerless. Jesus walked away from that widow, but he did so to complete his mission. For the moment, that mission was to continue to teach and preach. That's what Jesus did best, what he was known for, and how he exerted his greatest influence. He used his position as a religious reformer, a respected teacher and preacher, to get people to think. He asked them to think whether the temple system was working. Was the temple system working to serve that widow? Was the system working to serve the invisible, inconsequential poor and powerless? It wasn't, but Jesus knew it could. He knew that if we, God's people, were reconnected to our origin of love and mercy, we would be in service to the poor and powerless again. Jesus knew that if we remembered and accepted God's forgiveness and let go of our shame for the times we have looked through and walked past the poor and powerless, we would be free to be in their service again. if we accepted God's almost inexcusable grace towards us, we would gratefully serve the poor and powerless again as God had once served us manna in the desert. Like Jesus, none of us can help every individual. None can help with every cause. But, like Jesus, we have our positions. We have our spheres of influence, and we can use them. We are a great cloud of witnesses for the poor and powerless, and we are already involved in organizations and systems. We are so great a cloud of witnesses, and we are already in families, businesses, and neighborhoods. We are so great a cloud of witnesses for the poor and powerless in our churches who serve the hungry, those in thrall of addictions and mental illness, and those in need of medical care. We are so great a cloud of witnesses for the poor and powerless in a democracy where we have voice and vote. God never sees any of us as invisible or inconsequential, just the opposite. Each one of the invisible, vulnerable Sarahs of this world is of the utmost importance. Even if we never meet face to face, how will we show those who are told they are of no consequence that they are mistaken? How will we use our spheres of influence to be Jesus's great cloud of witnesses?